If you've followed the channel for any length of time, you probably know that I'm an avid fan of horror games. So over the last weekend, I thought it might be fun to rent a copy of Dead Space 3, having enjoyed Dead Space 1 and 2. And frankly, I was put off by just how bad the opening was to the game. Now, that's not to say that the game controlled poorly, or that it didn't look good or anything. It's just that it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a horror game. So I figured, why wait? Let's put together a video and talk about what makes for a successful horror game opening. To do this, I'm going to compare Dead Space 3's opening to Silent Hill 2's opening. Silent Hill 2 widely regarded as being one of the best, if not the best, survival horror games ever made. So let's start with Dead Space 3. We opened with wannabe Tobey Maguire here, some sort of futuristic space soldier, wandering in the snowy wastes looking for some sort of something.
Oh, thank God! Did you find it?
Find it. Doc, I'm not even sure what we're looking for.
Just follow the waypoint that sent you. I can't tell you anymore. Just get there. Do you hear me? You have to go.
What?
Oh, it's lost.
What? Dang it!
You can do this. Oh, he's dependent on you. You're a soldier, right? Right. Gun's not even loaded.
One of the things you might notice off the bat is just how talkative this guy is. Considering that he's not our main character and we're never going to see him again after this opening sequence, it's a peculiar design decision that I can't quite wrap my head around. But all of the dialogue is perhaps even a little more problematic than that. After all, it prevents the game from establishing a clear tone. There's no foreboding, no sense of dread, which I'll come back to in a moment. For now, let's turn our attention to Silent Hill 2. James's entrance is, well, for lack of a better term, lackluster. He simply walks up to the mirror and adjusts something on his face. In the background, we are greeted with a morose soundtrack, and other than that, silence. In fact, there's almost no dialogue in this opening moment, except for one thing.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
With the single line of dialogue, we know more about James Sunderland than we know about this other character with oodles of dialogue. We know that James is looking for someone called Mary, and we know that there's some incredulous disbelief about his entire situation. And from his tone, on top of all that, we can gather that he's not a very happy man. Silent Hill 2 has established a tone and the baseline of a character in just a few seconds without any of Dead Space 3's dialogue. Meanwhile, back on the planet, the Ice Soldier finds some sort of downed spacecraft, presumably important to his quest. There's more dialogue, and he breaks open a lock to get into the thing, where he is promptly greeted by space monsters. Oh no! Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with jump scares. As horror goes, they have their place in the medium and can be used remarkably effectively. To drop a jump scare this early though, without any kind of build-up or preparation, just feels cheap. There's no build-up, so there's no real payoff. There's just a sudden jump, and then you're in the game. But let's go back to Silent Hill 2 for a minute. There is quite a bit more dialogue right here. James delivers a long monologue where he exposits on exactly why he's returned to Silent Hill. We basically learn three things. First, James's wife Mary died 3 years earlier due to some disease. 2, that she loved Silent Hill, and apparently her special place, or at least did what James thinks is her special place, was down in Rosewater Park. Third, we learn that James has received a letter from his dead wife, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and James seems to agree. What follows next would seem very odd by Dead Space's standards. James spends the next several minutes just trekking through the woods into Silent Hill. There's no monsters, there's no jump scares, there's just some of the best sound design in any game ever. That's it. Just you, the woods, and time to be alone with your thoughts. While you can't shake the feeling you're being watched. But let's turn our attention back to Dead Space 3 for just a moment. After blasting your way through the spaceship, there's some sort of explosion, and generic Soldier McGee jumps out the side, only to slide down the mountain while being pursued by an exploding spacecraft. Raw, so epic! I reiterate, this is coming from something that posits to be a horror game. This just feels out of place. While something like this might be welcome in an action-adventure platformer like Uncharted, it doesn't make sense for any sort of slow, methodical horror game, or even really for an action-packed horror game. Moments like this that appeared in earlier Dead Space games appeared later on, and even in Alien Isolation, moments like this don't appear until the very end of the game, at which point they've kind of been warranted in terms of pacing. Again, it's an example of payoff without any build-up. Do we care that the ship is exploding? Do we care who this character is? No, we don't. Forget horror, forget tension. This is just sloppy storytelling. But let's turn our attention back to Silent Hill 2 one more time. After a brief encounter with Angela Orozco, James continues to make his way into Silent Hill. Again, this takes several minutes, at which point he finds bloodstains on the road and some sort of shadow wandering through the mist. James pursues it, and it takes him away from the city again and to some sort of back alley. Note that this entire time, the scene is completely silent. There's a real tension hanging in the air as you try to figure out what it is that James has stumbled onto, what horrors await. And as you approach this back alley, you're greeted with the sounds of discordant static. It's in this back alley that James meets the first enemy of the game, and the payoff is tremendous. Not only, if you're paying attention, can you see it out of the corner of the screen, but as the camera pans around to reveal it, you can feel the shock and horror coming from James. Notice how the camera jostles as James bumps into the plywood behind him, searching for a weapon. Though this is a video game, the cinematic representation of the fear and panic going through his mind is brilliantly done. James defeats the monster and then wanders once more back into the city of Silent Hill. The tension has been paid off, but with the knowledge that there are more monsters in the store and that mysteries wait for James, the build and release cycle of tension can begin once again. Dead Space 3, on the other hand, ends with Colonel Kurtz here offing our player character before saluting some sort of flag and offing himself. No, it doesn't really make sense, and no, it doesn't raise the stakes or anything, but hey, it looks cool and there's bodies, so that's scary, right? I could go further in depth with Dead Space 3's opening chapters. The first chapter after the prologue is no less embarrassing by any stretch of the imagination, where you're fighting human enemies that are cultists and you're witnessing giant explosions, and it's pretty stupid. You can just go rent the game yourself if you really want to look that up. But it doesn't change the fact that Dead Space 3 has a pitiful opening, and that it's fairly indicative of what the AAA market was trying to do with horror not too long ago. Other horror games like Silent Hill 2 have fantastic openings. Condemned Criminal Origins, one of the early games for the Xbox 360, has a fantastic opening. And I'm sure I don't need to talk to anyone here about just how wonderful the opening is to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. So I guess the takeaway from this should be that there are a few elements that are necessary for a horror game to properly introduce itself. 1. A horror game needs to establish tension. You can't keep throwing things at the player willy-nilly and hope for any sort of real drama or suspense. Not to mention, this makes for a terrible tutorial. 2. Introduction of the main horror and the main character should be slow and steady. Overloading the player with information is sure to backfire, so ease the player into it. Again, horror is slow, deliberate, and methodical. There's no need to rush into it. And finally, what is gruesome isn't necessarily what is frightening. Dead Space 3 tries to shock the player into being frightened, but at the end of the day, most of these monsters would be just as welcome in Mass Effect as they would be Dead Space. All of the bodies and dismemberment just can't match up to the slow psychological realization that you're not alone and you're not safe. The long and largely uneventful walk at the beginning of Silent Hill 2 is far, far more frightening than anything that the opening chapters of Dead Space can throw at you. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.